teenage boy stepped out of a crowd with a pistol in his hand. Within seconds, 2 people were dead. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Within years, more than 20 million people would lose their lives. The terrifying part is this. Many people at that moment did not even realize the world had already changed forever. One gunshot in a small European city pulled powerful empires into a chain reaction they could no longer stop. This is the true story of how World War I began. Not a legend, not fiction, not propaganda. A real story built from political tension, fear, nationalism, secret alliances, military ambition, and one deadly assassination that exploded an already unstable Europe. To understand why the war started, we must first understand Europe before 1914. Because World War I did not begin with the gunshot. The gunshot only lit the fire. The real explosion had been building for years. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe controlled much of the world. The British Empire ruled territories across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The French Third Republic had powerful colonies overseas. The German Empire was rapidly growing stronger through industry and military power. The Russian Empire stretched across enormous lands from Europe to Asia. And Austria-Hungary struggled to control many different ethnic groups inside its borders. Europe looked modern and civilized. Cities had electric lights. Factories produced enormous wealth. Railroads connected countries faster than ever before. But beneath that progress, the continent was becoming dangerously unstable. The first major problem was nationalism. Nationalism sounds simple, people loving their nation. But in early 20th century Europe, nationalism became something more dangerous. Many ethnic groups wanted independence. Many countries believed they were superior to others. Governments encouraged citizens to think about war as a matter of pride and honor. Nowhere was this tension stronger than in the Balkans. The Balkans were located in southeastern Europe. Different religions, languages, and ethnic groups lived there together for centuries. For years, the weakening Ottoman Empire had controlled much of the region. But as Ottoman power declined, new countries and nationalist movements appeared. One of those countries was Serbia. Serbia wanted to unite Slavic people across the Balkans into one powerful nation. This idea frightened Austria-Hungary. Why? Because millions of Slavic people already lived inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If nationalism spread, Austria-Hungary feared its empire could collapse from the inside. At the same time, another dangerous system was forming across Europe: military alliances. Countries promised to defend each other if war began. 2 major alliance groups slowly developed. The first was the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The second was the Triple Entente: Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were supposed to prevent war. Instead, they made war far more dangerous. Because now, if one country entered a conflict, others could be pulled in automatically. Europe was becoming like a line of dominoes. One push could knock everything down. Another major cause of tension was militarism. European countries were building enormous armies and navies. Germany especially expanded its military power quickly after unification in the 19th century. Its leaders believed military strength was necessary for survival and influence. Meanwhile, Britain worried about Germany's growing navy, An arms race began between the two nations. Battleships became symbols of national power. Military leaders gained more influence inside governments. War plans were created years before the fighting even started. Germany developed the famous Schlieffen Plan. The idea was simple but dangerous. If war broke out, Germany planned to quickly defeat France in the west before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. This plan depended on speed. And to attack France quickly, Germany planned to move through neutral Belgium. That decision would later pull Britain into the war. But in 1914, most ordinary citizens did not fully understand how fragile Europe had become. Many people believed large-scale war was impossible. Trade connected economies. Science and technology were advancing rapidly. Some believed civilization had become too modern for another massive European war. They were wrong. In June 1914, attention turned toward the city of Sarajevo. Sarajevo was located in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Austria-Hungary had officially annexed Bosnia in 1908. Many Serbian nationalists were furious about this. Among them was a secret revolutionary organization connected to Serbian nationalist networks. One of the young men influenced by these ideas was Gavrilo Princip. Princip was 19 years old, thin, quiet, poor, and deeply political. He believed Austria-Hungary was oppressing Slavic people. He and several other young conspirators planned something shocking. They would assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. That man was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ironically, Franz Ferdinand was not the most extreme leader inside the empire. Some historians believe he actually wanted reforms that could have given more rights to ethnic groups within Austria-Hungary. But to the assassins, he represented imperial control. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand traveled to Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. Security preparations were weak. Even more shocking, officials publicly announced the Archduke's travel route before the visit. Several assassins positioned themselves along the streets. Each carried weapons. As the royal motorcade moved through the city, one assassin lost his courage. Another failed to act. Then one conspirator threw a bomb toward the Archduke's car. The bomb bounced off the folded roof and exploded under another vehicle behind them. Several officers and civilians were injured, but Franz Ferdinand survived. The failed assassin attempted suicide but was captured. At this point, the royal visit should have ended immediately, but Franz Ferdinand decided to continue the schedule. Later that morning, the Archduke planned to visit wounded officers in the hospital. During the drive, the motorcade took a wrong turn, and by extraordinary coincidence, the car stopped near Gavrilo Princip. Princip could hardly believe what he was seeing. The target was suddenly standing directly in front of him. He stepped forward, pulled out his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other hit Sophie in the abdomen. Both died shortly afterward. The assassination shocked Europe, but many people still believed the crisis could be controlled. They had no idea how quickly the situation would spiral out of control. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed Serbia. Leaders in Vienna believed Serbian nationalism threatened the survival of their empire. But before acting, Austria-Hungary wanted support from Germany. In early July 1914, Austrian officials met with German leaders. Germany gave Austria-Hungary what historians call the blank check. This meant Germany promised strong support, even if military conflict followed. That decision became one of the most important turning points before the war. Encouraged by German backing, Austria-Hungary prepared an extremely harsh ultimatum for Serbia. The ultimatum included demands designed to be difficult to accept completely. Austria-Hungary wanted to crush Serbian nationalist influence permanently. On July 23, 1914, the ultimatum was delivered. Europe watched nervously. Serbia accepted most of the demands. But Serbian leaders rejected several conditions that would allow Austro-Hungarian officials to operate inside Serbia itself. Austria-Hungary declared the response insufficient. 5 days later, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. The crisis had now become international, and Europe's alliance system was about to activate. Russia viewed itself as a protector of Slavic nations, including Serbia. When Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, Russia began military mobilization. Germany saw Russian mobilization as a direct threat. German leaders feared that waiting too long would place them at a military disadvantage. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Soon afterward, Germany declared war on France. Then, Germany activated the Schlieffen Plan and invaded Belgium. That invasion changed everything. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality through earlier treaties. When German troops entered Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. Within weeks, most major European powers were at war. What began as a political crisis in the Balkans had become a global conflict, and millions of ordinary people were suddenly trapped inside it. Young men rushed to enlist. Crowds waved flags in city streets. Many believed the war would end quickly. Some soldiers thought they would return home within months. Instead, Europe was marching toward one of the deadliest catastrophes in human history. And the worst had not even begun yet. By August 1914, Europe was no longer arguing about war. Europe was already inside it. Governments made speeches about honor and victory. Newspapers printed patriotic headlines. Crowds gathered in city squares, waving flags and cheering for soldiers. In German Empire, thousands of young men rushed to enlist. In France, train stations filled with emotional families saying goodbye. In Russian Empire, churches held prayers for victory. In Great Britain, posters appeared everywhere calling men to join the army. Many people believed the war would last only a few months. They thought modern nations were too advanced for a long conflict. They were completely wrong. The governments of Europe had entered a war they did not fully understand. And very quickly, the violence became larger than anyone imagined. Germany moved first. Its military leaders believed speed was the key to survival. The German army activated the Schlieffen Plan, the strategy prepared years before the war began. The goal was simple: defeat France quickly in the west before Russia could fully organize its enormous army in the east. To do this, Germany invaded neutral Belgium. That decision shocked Europe. Belgium had not attacked Germany, it was officially neutral. But German military planners believed marching through Belgium was the fastest way to reach Paris. On August 4, 1914, German troops crossed the Belgian border. Almost immediately, stories of destruction began spreading. Bridges were destroyed, towns were occupied, Civilians fled their homes carrying children and bags of food. The invasion also changed British public opinion. Until then, some people in Britain were uncertain about entering the war. But Britain had promised to protect Belgian neutrality. When Germany invaded Belgium, the British government declared war. Now the conflict was no longer regional. The most powerful empires in the world were fighting each other. The German advance moved rapidly through Belgium and into France. For a moment, it seemed Germany might win quickly. German troops marched enormous distances every day. French and British forces struggled to stop them. By early September 1914, the German army approached the area near Paris. Fear spread across France. Government offices prepared to evacuate the capital. Some civilians fled the city entirely. But then came one of the most important moments of the early war. First Battle of the Marne. French and British forces launched a desperate counterattack against the advancing Germans. Taxi drivers in Paris even helped transport French soldiers toward the front lines. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Thousands died within days. But the German advance finally stopped. Germany failed to capture Paris, and because of that failure, the war changed completely. Instead of a fast victory, Europe entered a long and terrible stalemate. Both sides began digging trenches. At first, soldiers believed trenches were temporary. But soon, massive trench systems stretched across hundreds of miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. This became the Western Front, and life inside the trenches was horrifying. Mud covered everything. Rats fed on dead bodies. Rain flooded the ground until soldiers stood in dirty water for days. Disease spread rapidly. Many soldiers developed trench foot, a painful condition caused by wet and freezing conditions. The smell was unbearable. Rotting bodies often remained trapped between enemy lines because retrieving them was too dangerous. This area became known as no man's land. Crossing it usually meant death. Machine guns had changed warfare completely. In earlier wars, soldiers often charged across open fields. But now machine guns could fire hundreds of bullets every minute. Attacking soldiers were cut down almost instantly. Military leaders had not fully understood how deadly modern weapons had become. As a result, commanders repeatedly ordered massive attacks that killed enormous numbers of men for very little gain. One of the deadliest new weapons was artillery. Huge guns fired explosive shells across long distances. In many battles, artillery caused more deaths than rifles or machine guns. Soldiers described the constant shelling as psychological torture. The explosions never seemed to stop. Some men completely lost the ability to speak after surviving bombardments. Others suffered what became known as shell shock. Today, it would likely be called severe psychological trauma. But at the time, many officers misunderstood it. Some believed traumatized soldiers were cowards. In reality, many minds simply broke under the pressure of industrial warfare. Meanwhile, the war spread far beyond Western Europe. On the Eastern Front, Germany and Austria-Hungary fought against Russia across enormous territories. The fighting there moved more than in the West, but casualties were still catastrophic. In 1914, Russia invaded East Prussia, but suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg. German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff became national heroes after the victory. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. But despite losses, Russia continued fighting because of its enormous population. The war also spread into the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, because European empires controlled colonies around the world. This was no longer just a European conflict. It had become a global war. In 1915, another horrifying weapon appeared: poison gas. During the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces released chlorine gas toward Allied trenches. Soldiers watched green clouds moving slowly across the battlefield. Then panic began. Men coughed violently, their lungs burned. Some suffocated where they stood. Later in the war, both sides used different forms of chemical weapons, including mustard gas. Gas masks became standard equipment for soldiers, but fear of chemical attacks haunted the trenches constantly. World War I was becoming a terrifying example of industrialized killing. Modern science and technology were not only improving life, they were also making war more efficient and more deadly. At sea, Britain used its powerful navy to blockade Germany. The blockade limited food and supplies entering the country. Over time, shortages inside Germany became severe. Civilians suffered from hunger and malnutrition. Germany responded with submarine warfare. German U-boats attacked ships crossing the Atlantic. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 1915 when the passenger ship RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine. Nearly 1,200 people died, including Americans. The sinking shocked the United States. Although America did not immediately enter the war, public opinion toward Germany became more negative. At this point, the war was already destroying an entire generation. And still, leaders on all sides believed victory was possible. So the fighting continued. In 1916, the war reached even greater levels of destruction. At the Battle of Verdun, Germany attempted to bleed France white through relentless attacks. The battle lasted for months. Hundreds of thousands died. French commanders repeatedly declared, "They shall not pass." Meanwhile, Britain and France launched the Battle of the Somme to relieve pressure on Verdun. The first day of the Somme became one of the deadliest days in British military history. Nearly 60,000 British casualties occurred in a single day. Many soldiers were killed within minutes after climbing out of trenches. Machine guns cut through entire waves of advancing troops. The Somme also introduced a new weapon, the tank. Early tanks were slow and unreliable, but they represented the beginning of a new era in warfare. By now, World War I had transformed into something humanity had never seen before. Entire nations were mobilized for total war. Factories produced weapons constantly. Women entered industrial jobs in huge numbers because millions of men were fighting. Governments controlled economies, newspapers, and public information. Every major power was sacrificing enormous amounts of human life. And despite millions already dead or wounded, the war still had years left to go. The world that existed before 1914 was disappearing, and soon, even larger disasters would arrive, and the worst had not even begun yet. By 1917, World War I had already consumed much of Europe. Millions were dead. Entire regions had been destroyed by artillery, trench warfare, disease, hunger, and exhaustion. What many people believed would be a short war had turned into a nightmare without an end. And now, the countries involved were beginning to break from the inside. In the Russian Empire, the situation became catastrophic. Russia had suffered enormous military losses since the beginning of the war. Weapons were limited. Transportation systems failed. Food shortages spread across major cities. Many Russian soldiers lacked proper boots, ammunition, or medical care. At home, ordinary civilians waited in long bread lines during freezing winters. People grew angry at the government of Nicholas II. The Tsar was increasingly blamed for military failures and economic collapse. By early 1917, protests exploded across the capital city of Petrograd. Workers went on strike. Crowds marched through the streets demanding food and political change. Then something extremely dangerous happened. Russian soldiers began refusing orders. Some troops even joined the protesters. The government rapidly lost control. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. After more than 300 years, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. But removing the Tsar did not end Russia's problems. A temporary government took power, yet it made one critical decision. Russia would continue fighting the war. That decision became deeply unpopular. At the same time, revolutionary groups gained more support. The most important were the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin promised three simple things: peace, land, bread. For exhausted soldiers and starving civilians, those promises sounded powerful. Later, in 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power during the October Revolution. Soon afterward, Russia began leaving the war. In 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. The Eastern Front largely collapsed. Germany could now move many soldiers westward. For a moment, Germany believed victory was finally possible. But another major power was entering the war. The United States had remained officially neutral for most of the conflict. Many Americans believed the war was a European problem. However, several events slowly changed public opinion. German submarine attacks against civilian and commercial ships created growing anger. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania had already shocked Americans earlier in the war. Then Germany made another major mistake. In 1917, British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram. Germany secretly proposed an alliance with Mexico. The message suggested that if America entered the war against Germany, Mexico should attack the United States. When the telegram became public, outrage spread across America. At the same time, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. American ships were now at risk. President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. In April 1917, the United States officially entered World War I. The arrival of American troops and industrial support would eventually become one of the most important turning points of the war. Meanwhile, conditions inside the Central Powers became increasingly desperate. The British naval blockade continued damaging the German economy. Food shortages worsened. Many civilians suffered from hunger and disease. Austria-Hungary was also collapsing internally. Different ethnic groups inside the empire demanded independence. National unity weakened more every month. Still, Germany launched one final major offensive in 1918. German leaders understood they needed victory before American forces fully arrived in Europe. At first, the offensive achieved significant gains. German troops pushed deep into Allied territory. But the army was exhausted. supplies became difficult to maintain, and Allied resistance strengthened as more American soldiers entered combat. Soon, the offensive failed. Then the Allies counterattacked. Germany began retreating. Military leaders increasingly realized the war could no longer be won. Inside Germany itself, unrest spread rapidly. Workers protested. Food shortages intensified. Morale collapsed. German sailors even mutinied against their officers. The political system started falling apart. Then, in November 1918, Wilhelm II abdicated. The German monarchy collapsed just as the Russian monarchy had collapsed earlier. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed the Armistice Agreement. At 11 a.m., the fighting officially stopped. After more than 4 years of war, the guns finally fell silent. But the damage was beyond imagination. World War I killed approximately 20 million people and wounded millions more. Entire towns lost most of their young men. A generation returned home physically and psychologically shattered. Many soldiers never fully recovered from what they had seen. Europe's political map changed dramatically. The German Empire collapsed. Austria-Hungary disappeared entirely. The Ottoman Empire fell apart, and the Russian Empire transformed into Soviet Russia after revolution and civil war. New countries appeared across Europe and the Middle East. But peace did not bring true stability. In 1919, world leaders gathered at the Paris Peace Conference to create a new international order. One of the most important agreements was the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war. The treaty imposed severe financial penalties, military restrictions, and territorial losses. Many Germans considered the treaty humiliating and unfair. The anger and economic suffering that followed would later help create conditions for another global conflict, World War II. In many ways, the end of World War I planted the seeds for the next World War, and it all began with a political crisis in the Balkans. One assassination. One collapsing alliance system. One chain reaction of fear, nationalism, militarism, and revenge. The leaders of Europe believed they could control the situation. Instead, they unleashed destruction on a scale the world had never seen before. World War I changed warfare forever. It changed politics forever. And it changed millions of human lives forever. The world before 1914 disappeared in the trenches of Europe, and from its ashes, a new and far more dangerous century emerged.